Hi guys, welcome to the follow-on episode of Michael's liver surgery from my perspective. So my perspective is in no way overshadowing what Michael went through or how he felt. It's more of a deeper dive into events that occurred and more of a timeline of things that happened, just to get a bit more understanding out there that he was going in for this major surgery and we were so prepared for the timeline that we were given, that it hadn't even crossed my mind that things could go wrong to the extent they did. After multiple surgeries, quite a lot longer stay in ICU, families can also expect to feel emotionally drained and devastated and question everything at those points in time. So the day of the surgery, we had to be in the hospital at 6 a.m. in the morning for Michael to be checked into the planned procedure unit. It was then that we found out his surgeon had another surgery booked in that day as well, which was quite a shorter surgery. So from 6 a.m. till 12 o'clock, we were in the planned procedure unit just waiting for Michael to be taken back. Just after 12 o'clock, it would have been, he was called in to be taken back towards the operating theatres, and that's when we had to say our goodbyes. So once me and Chad left the hospital, we tried to do a few small things to take our minds off it. In the end, Chad just wanted to go back to where we were staying and just veg out, which is what essentially we did whilst I was making the calls to family to let them know that he'd gone in and that we were just waiting now. From the time that he went in to about the 5-hour mark, we weren't expecting to hear anything, and it was absolutely a no news, good news situation. Once that 5 hours passed, it sort of started the process of looking at the time and time watching, which is not good in any situation, especially when you are waiting and waiting and waiting for some kind of news. Again, we were fully prepared that this could have been a 5 to 7 hour surgery. So not that it wasn't weighing on my mind at all, but it hadn't become a massively stressful situation at that point. By 6 hours, I did have our son asking us, where's Dad? Have you heard from the doctor? To which I had no answers. And the only thing I could do was try and take his mind off it, building forts and watching cartoons and whatever else we did on that day, to be honest. Come the 7-hour mark was when I started to get really worried. As much as you think to yourself, he's got this, it's all good, there are the thoughts that creep in. And at the same point, trying to keep in touch with family, let them know. Obviously, they're just as worried that 7 hours has passed and we hadn't heard anything. So I called the hospital not long after that and got put through to the planned procedure unit just for an update. Unfortunately, they weren't able to give me much. They were just able to tell me that he was still in the operating theatre. It wasn't until just past 9 o'clock that I received a phone call from the surgeon in the operating theatre letting me know how the surgery went, and very limited details on what happened, but the reason it took so long. So the tumours were quite a bit more advanced than they could see on the scans, which was always a possibility. They did have to sacrifice one of his main arteries leading into his liver. They weren't able to save it. And the other one, there was very, very small margin to no margin of taking that tumour out. The other tumours that were within his liver, he feels very confident that they got a really good margin on them. So they took out more tissue than tumour to ensure that there was no cancer cells left behind or no tumour left behind. However, we do need to continue to monitor that main large tumour that was attached to both of his arteries. So the surgeon advised us that Michael would be going to the ICU, which we were fully aware that he would be in the ICU for 24 to 48 hours post this surgery, being such a major surgery. And the ICU would call me with an update when they had him all settled and had him, I guess, settled in, and we could come up and see him. So from then, we didn't hear anything from the ICU for quite some time. So I spent the time on the phone to family, to my mother-in-law, to my mum, my brother, who were all amazing in helping me continue to be sane and function for my child during this time. So I called again the hospital and the ICU unit just to check that Michael was there and that things hadn't taken a downturn from the time that Michael's surgeon had called me. They did advise that Michael was there, but unfortunately they were having a lot of drama waking him up. After such a long surgery, he just needed a little bit more time to come to and for them to set him up. So I think it was only maybe about an hour after that the ICU actually called me back and said, hey, he's all good to go. You can come and see him if you want to. By the time we got to the hospital, it was just prior to 11 o'clock that night. So 11 hours since we'd seen him when he went in. So a lot of nervous energy, a lot of excited energy. Chad was just beside himself. We did have a big conversation with Chad about what Michael could look like to ensure that he wasn't shocked or scared when he walked in and seen a lot of tubes or wires as Michael was in the bed. So when we got to the hospital that night and walking into the ICU, I was quite shocked to see that he was sitting half upright, so he was raised, which I guess makes a lot of sense in theory, but it's just not something I didn't know what I'd be walking into. So tubes, wires, masks, the lot were coming off him. Chad was straight up to his bedside, having a chat, telling him about his day, and quite excited to see that Dad was okay, which at that point I thought was the hard yards are done and dusted, and it's all uphill for here. We just have to get him through this recovery process. So after getting into bed, after my round of phone calls to everybody, I was woken up with a phone call from a private number at just past 4 o'clock in the morning from the ICU doctor telling me that unfortunately Michael became quite unstable during early hours of the morning and was in quite a significant amount of pain, to which they did an ultrasound and found that he was bleeding internally from his liver, and they were rushing him back to theatre and needed my consent to go ahead with a second surgery. They did advise that this surgery would be a couple of hours and they would contact me as soon as they were able to, or as soon as they had any news to give me. So from 4 a.m, obviously took me a little minute to process what had just happened. Devastated is the only word that I could even think of using with how I felt at that time. It wasn't until just before 7 o'clock that I received a phone call from Michael's surgeon to say that this second operation went well. They did have to drain out over half a litre of blood and put a drain tube in just below his surgical incision. The biggest thing they were worried about, I guess, was the cauterized artery that they had to cut, popping back open and bleeding, because that would have been quite a faster bleed. His liver actually stopped retaining blood at that point, so the blood was seeping out through his liver, not through any incision point. So they did cover the liver in some kind of, I don't know, maybe like adhesive sort of thing. Didn't exactly ask the terminology at that point in time. I just did not care. I just wanted to know he was okay. But essentially they've covered the liver in something to stop that leak, which seemed to be holding. So we were back up at that hospital. We left straight away. As soon as that call came through, we were already ready to go. We were dressed, everything was ready, we were just walking out the door. So we drove back. We got to the hospital at about just past 7 o'clock in the morning, and again, he had more tubes, more wires, more machines hooked up to everything. He was so out of it and would have been so exhausted, and yet still made the biggest energy to acknowledge that both me and Chad were there. Absolute gave the biggest energy in trying to communicate with Chad, which was very, very minimal at that stage. It was one word, it was nods, very slight movements of the head, to which was expected. We thought he would be asleep. So from that second surgery, right through that day, he seemed to be holding his own really well. He was doing really well. His stats were quite stable at that point. We were back in and out of that hospital countless times that day. Obviously with a 10-year-old, it can become quite overwhelming for them. So we had our own little code for him. He didn't have to ask to leave. He didn't have to tell me he wasn't comfortable. He just had to tell me he was hungry or he needed a drink, which I knew meant that the time was up. He needed a bit of a break without him having to say it. So we were in and out quite a few times. I let him dictate when he wanted to go in, when he wanted to leave. It was all solely based around making sure we were there for Michael. And obviously I wanted to be there constantly, the whole day. If they had let me, I would have just sat there the whole day. But at that point it was just me and Chad, and I also had to think about his best interests and what was going to be best for him. I know there's been a few people that have said ICU's not the place for children, you shouldn't have taken him. As a parent, I did what I thought was best for my child at that point. It's a discussion me and Michael had had prior, and we knew keeping Chad out of that hospital at that point would have been more detrimental to his mental health, not being able to actually see his dad. Chad was asked if he wanted to go or if he preferred not to see Michael like that, and his response was, no one can keep me from my dad. So that's the reason we made the decision that Chad could come and go as he pleased whenever he wanted at that point. So again, after Michael having such a stable day, I guess I got a little complacent in thoughts again that, you know, he'd done the hard yards. This was the end of it. We just had to get him better. We had to get him through this recovery. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And the next morning I called the ICU for an update, and was told that unfortunately Michael's oxygen saturations had dropped dangerously low, and they were on the verge of putting him in an induced coma and intubating him. However, while setting up for that intubation, they put him on a high flow oxygen mask. So at that point, I think he was 80 litres per minute, and he seemed to be able to hold his own with that amount of oxygen being pumped in. So essentially what had happened is he had suffered a partial lung collapse of both lungs early hours of that morning, and we just had to now wait and see how long he could be on that mask for, if that mask would continue to work, and if they could keep his oxygen saturation at the right level, at a safe level for him, for his recovery. So again, we rushed back up to the hospital at that point. Not that we obviously did not believe the nurses in any way, shape or form. I think sometimes when you hear news like that, you just need to be there. You need to be with them. You need to see it with your own eyes, to process it. And so we got there, and again, you could hear the pressure of the mask pumping the oxygen into him. That was essentially keeping him alive at that point. So it was a very hard day to be there. It was a very emotional day for everybody involved, and you could at that point see how much pain he was in, which was really hard to see someone that you love going through something so terrifying and being in so much pain. Due to the partial lung collapse putting a lot of pressure on his body and causing him a lot of pain, they did decide to insert 2 tubes into either side of his spine to give him pain relief directly where it was needed, which would have been an absolute godsend for him. It meant that his body and his mind could start recovering from what he'd just gone through. So during that day, I did take time again to contact the immediate family members, give them updates, give them a rundown on what had happened since I'd last spoken to them. At this point, I had 4 main contacts, 4 people who I was contacting, and then they were able to give that news to the other family members and any friends that needed to know. So I had my mother-in-law, my parents, my brother and Michael's sister, so my sister-in-law, and each of them brought an emotional support that was so needed at that time for myself. So at that point, there were so many different emotions that I was feeling that was so overwhelming: sadness, disbelief, anger, hopefulness. And each of these family members brought a different perspective in their own way that helped me so much during this journey. You know, sometimes you need someone there just to reiterate and tell you he's going to be okay and he's tough and he's going to get through it. And I could not have gone through this without my parents being that support, being so hopeful all the time, that I could feel that energy, that I could feel, and I could believe at those points when I was talking to them that, you know, he does have this, he's too tough, he's not going anywhere yet. And then sometimes you just needed someone that would sit there and feel that sadness, that would feel that devastation, and I got that from my mother-in-law. We would sit on the phone and just cry, and at the same time get angry about him being in this situation, about, you know, it's not fair, it's just not fair. Sharing that sadness with someone that could potentially have lost their son, and I got that support from her. I got, you know, it felt okay to release those feelings, to talk to her about that. And then you have the points where you're just so mad about it. You're just so cranky and angry and it's not fair. And, you know, I'd call my brother and he would be the one that would just say, this is really crap. Like, let me vent, let me carry on like an absolute pork chop at points. And was always there and never, you know, didn't try to put a spin on it, didn't try to talk over me and tell me you can't think these things, you know, you have to be positive. Sometimes you just need to not be positive. Sometimes you just need to let those feelings of frustration and anger out. And he was that point of call, and he was there for me day and night. And I couldn't have got through this. I couldn't have got through this without him, because that would have been a bottled up emotion, and that potentially would have been a very dangerous emotion to have bottled up for quite a while. Michael's sister knew a lot more about the medical side of things, so being able to talk to her and talk her through what was happening, and having her go, oh, this could be the reason for that, and giving me advice on, you know, questions I might not have asked, and asking me questions that I didn't think to ask, that essentially gave me better answers when I was able to go in there and ask. So having that support from someone that knew a little bit more about that medical side of things was absolutely just, I was so grateful to have that. And for each and every one of them, I couldn't have gotten through. I couldn't have gotten through and functioned for our 10-year-old son at that point if I didn't have them. So later on that night, me and Chad were actually heading back to the hospital again to go and visit Michael, and we got a phone call from my parents, from my mum, who was asking what the address was where we were staying, of the unit that we were staying in, and to let us know that they had packed their bags and were in the car on their way to Brisbane. They were staying in Brisbane with my uncle and auntie that night, and were getting the first plane out of there in the morning to come up and be here for not only Michael but for me and Chad as well. And that was the first time that I cried in front of Chad and was able to tell him that it was happy tears. Emotionally, I was trying to hold everything in and function and let him feel what he needed to feel and let him know that it was okay. But to know that I was going to have that physical support that could be with Chad while I was at the hospital, that could be there for Michael as well when he came out, was I couldn't have thought of a better thing that could have happened at that point in time with the way everything was going. So the next morning we were up bright and early and back at that hospital again, to which we came into the ICU to what would have been the first sign of good news that we had had in days. The news was that they had taken Michael off the mask at 3:30 in the morning to check his lung function, which had slightly improved. So even though he was still on the mask again at that point when we turned up, he was dialed down from 80 litres per minute to 50 litres per minute and was able to take bigger breaths to get that oxygen into his lungs. So all throughout that day, we were coming and going from the ICU. We, at 8:30, when they ask you to leave until 12 o'clock, because the doctors do their rounds, and because the rooms don't have doors, they just have curtains. Obviously, for the privacy of other patients, you can't be in there because you could quite clearly hear what was happening with anybody else at that point in time. So we left that morning and went and picked my mum and dad up from the airport, and I was able to fill them in a little bit more, and while not give them great news, give them better news than I was able to give anybody. So right throughout that day we were coming and going from the hospital, and he remained the same. So there was no winning moment where he had miraculously taken a huge leap forward at that point in time, but there was no deterioration either, which was all we could ask for. It was all we could ask for at that point in time, was that he stayed stable enough for his body to be able to start repairing itself from the original major surgery days and days prior. So by the next day, we came into the ICU and they had him sitting up in a chair. So we had no idea what we were walking into. We had no updates. I called the hospital again that morning for an update and was told he was doing really well. I didn't realise how well he was doing until we turned up and they had him sitting in a chair trying to withstand some foods, so jellies, clear broths, little bits of water. And that was the first time I cried in ICU, because that was the first time I thought, he has finally beaten the hardest parts and he's finally onto the recovery side of things. So while he continued to gradually get better and better in ICU, they made the decision to transfer him to the general ward. And he was transferred at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, taken to the general ward, set up, everything was all good. general wards visiting hours were 8 a.m. till 8 p.m. So by 8 o'clock we had to leave him. He was a lot more alert. He could use his phone, so we were able to keep in contact with him a lot more. I was able to talk to him a lot more. He was able to reach out and talk to his mum, and things looked like they were going really, really well at that point. So Michael was in the general surgery ward for a week, and during that time he was taken for an ultrasound. No one actually knew what the ultrasound was for at that point to tell us. We were only told when he came back that they were looking for a blood clot in his arm. So it turns out he did form a blood clot in the right arm, which was causing him quite a significant amount of pain, numbness to the right hand, tingling in the fingertips. So quite an uncomfortable thing for him to be going through, as well as the pain from his incision. He was taken off all of his pain relief at that point and was just on pain relief when required. So the second day Michael was in the general surgery ward, they had physio come around to help him get out of bed, help him move, help him walk, and run through a few exercises that needed to be done from here on out. He managed to walk aided a little bit and did tell everybody that by tomorrow I'll be walking down this hallway. And lo and behold, the next day he was walking unattended by himself down the entire hallway. He just set his mind to something and would achieve it. He's so strong-willed, and to see what he was just days prior to how fast he was able to push his recovery, because he just had the mentality that I can do this. I've got things to do. I want to get out of here. There's plans in motion and I haven't finished them. And his attitude through this whole thing was just, he was making everybody laugh. He was just himself, and it was so good to see that he had the ability to still continue to care about so many other people when he was going through something so horrific himself. He was in quite a large amount of pain, and yet he was still trying to crack jokes. He was still making everybody laugh. So after a shorter stay in the general surgery unit that we thought he would have to have, because he was progressing so well with his recovery, they let him come back to the unit. The unit had 16 stairs in which he had to go up just to get to the front door, and I was terrified about the amount of pain that he would have to go through to get up those stairs. But he just had this determination to do it, and he got up there and got in, and was probably in a bit of pain when he reached the top, but didn't let it show, and was just happy to be out, was just happy to be able to spend time with Chad, and my parents were there, and he kept doing his exercises as needed and his recovery as needed. He was going for walks and was talking about all these future plans that we have, and we did get some good news while we were down there, which you would either have seen in a previous video or you will see in a future video very shortly, which I think aided his recovery. Anybody that knows him will know he has worked towards this for quite some time now, and I think that was giving him a good push along to get better and get out. We are aware that he has to go back for more chemotherapy. He does have to have another surgery. He does have to have radiation, but he just fought one of the biggest fights I've ever seen anyone fight, and came out on top and won, essentially. So I guess that's just a small brief touch on what happened. There were so many more little things in between, and obviously time felt like it was at a standstill for so much of that. Probably for Michael, but I can definitely say it did for me. and having people there to support you and accepting that help was a major thing that got me through this ordeal that Michael had to go through. It's not just the person that has cancer that goes through this, it's their whole family, all their loved ones. They're all affected. Everybody's affected, and there is help out there if you need it. You just have to ask for it.